and this is a deep question, but in your opinion, being trafficked online in a hotel, is it any different than being on the streets?
I actually feel like in a hotel, it's almost like being in a cage, because in like a prison, you actually feel the shackles more because like you're not seeing outside people. When I did escape, I was actually put outside, and that's the day I escaped. So I had a better chance of being outside, even though it's all bad. Like nobody wants to be involved in that any way, shape, or form. I think it's worse in a hotel room because nobody can see or hear you. And even there was a situation where somebody like put the deadbolt on, and that was that. Like I couldn't get out.
Surviving Now is a production of Karana Rising. On June 17th, City X Guide's CEO Wilson Martono was arrested on charges including sex trafficking. His website, designed to facilitate the sex trade, was a virtual marketplace where victims of trafficking were bought and sold in plain sight. Federal charges allege he set up a sex trade website on an international scale, raking in $21 million in proceeds within a 2-year span. These profits account to both those willingly in the sex trade and sex trafficking victims, both adults and children. A 13-year-old girl from Texas is one of the victims whose traffickers sold her on City X Guide. Many people question, are online publishers like City X Guide the fourth element to sex trafficking in America today? Traffickers profit. Men and women who buy sex get what they pay for. Online publishers profit. Victims of sex trafficking only receive arrests, abuse, rape, and a lifetime of trauma. So what is the price we are willing to pay to stop sex trafficking happening in plain sight?
Hey, Asia.
Hey, how are you?
Good to see you again. So you are joining us for part of our segment of our show, episode 11, The Price You Pay, speaking to the fact that yet another international website has been recently taken down. That was a website that was knowingly facilitating the selling of women and girls who are in the sex trade, both willingly as well as those who are survivors and victims of sex trafficking. So, thought of you because as we were talking about earlier, you and I have been addressing online sex trafficking and sex trafficking at large together since 2010.
Right.
I think that you are probably at least 30% responsible for Craig Newmark going crazy and eventually taking his website, his adult section down. But the reality is we both know that like trafficking still happens. It still happens.
Right.
So as someone who's a survivor, as someone who's been an advocate in the field for as long as you have, hearing that another website's being taken down, like how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel conflicting. Like in one way, it's awesome that it's been taken down because like, you know, it's preventing another way that somebody's trafficked online. But the sad part is that at least for 10 years that me and you have known each other, that we're still taking down websites. So I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but I'm relieved that it has been taken down.
Yeah, and I think that's totally valid because, you know, it's not like taking down City X Guide or Backpage in 2018 when they went down through a federal investigation. A lot of people think it was because of this legislation, FOSTA SESTA, that we'll talk about, but it was really a Senate investigation, ultimately an FBI arrest. So
Right.
that trial's going forward in January, but you know, the reality is ending sex trafficking will take so much more than that, as well as protecting those who are in the sex trade kind of at large. And I think that's been a really interesting challenge is there's a lot of organizations and individual sex workers who claim to be there in a willing way, who are really upset about these websites being taken down and feel like it is discrimination. They feel like it's an attack on their business, on their livelihood. And I really feel for them, you know, obviously, but and this is a deep question, but in your opinion, being trafficked online in a hotel, is it any different than being on the streets?
I actually feel like in a hotel, it's almost like being in a cage because in like a prison, you actually feel the shackles more because like you're not seeing outside people. When I did escape, I was actually put outside, and that's the day I escaped. So I had a better chance of being outside, even though it's all bad. Like nobody wants to be involved in that any way, shape, or form. I think it's worse in a hotel room because nobody can see or hear you. And even there was a situation where somebody like put the deadbolt on, and that was that. Like I couldn't get out. So.
And I think I've heard that from so many survivors I've worked with, where being inside in a hotel or an apartment or a different kind of building, or somebody comes and their intent to do even more harm than a sexual assault,
Mm-hmm.
there's really very little you can do. And you know, another thing that some survivors and some sex workers are saying is that pimps can protect them in those scenarios, that's what the pimp's job is. So I wanted to know what you thought about that.
I definitely don't agree. I feel like all they do is protect their money. Like if it comes down to between the money and the girl, they're gonna get their money, and they possibly will leave the girl for dead, like 99.9% of the time.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
the thing, and you know, and I think so many people don't know some of the statistics. So you know, you and I, we sat there years ago doing the math of figuring out if someone is involved in a sex trafficking situation, they're being victimized, they have to make a certain amount of money, they're probably having to have sex with 5 men a night, and you multiply that by every day because there's not really like a vacation package.
Right.
You're talking about thousands of sexual assaults. And so
Yes.
so I've started trying to refer to sex trafficking as serial rape for profit. And I wanted to know what you thought about that term.
It is serial rape. It definitely is. And it's like, there's no type of like, no medical attention, no mental health type of like resources for the victims. And it's back to back to back. Imagine one person like going through something one time that already will affect them for the rest of their lives. So it's crazy to imagine like somebody 10 times a day. Like you said, it's serial rapists.
And the thing is, there's no word for that kind of intensity of trauma.
Right.
You know, as someone who's also a survivor of sexual assault, I still have to deal with that, but I it's a very different scenario than, you know, being trapped in a hotel. And I think,
Right.
you know, for me, like really getting to the heart of ending sex trafficking, it is raising awareness and holding everybody accountable, be you know, someone like Backpage or City X Guide, or even Pornhub, because I hear that they, you know, are capturing images of trafficking victims being assaulted and then selling those and doing that on Pornhub. So there's all these different websites, and going after them individually is exhausting. But at the same time, we're on this journey, I think, as society to figure out like what is it about our society that enables this stuff to happen out in the open? Because, you know, if I can go online and find a trafficking victim, or you can do that, then we know that law enforcement can, and we know all these other people can, and yet it just keeps mounting. And so from your perspective, like what else needs to be done beyond just going after online providers like
Law enforcement and city officials need training, because we can keep saying like, police all day, but what about like who the police answer to, like the mayor, even the governor, so that it can really be enforced? Because like if it's just the local law enforcement in DC that's getting training, what about Maryland and Virginia that are like 20 minutes away on either side? So it has to come from something huger.
Exactly. And I think, you know, resources, you know, things that are going to keep people safe. So I'm hearing from survivors that they've had their landlords approach them saying, if you have sex with me or my friends, I'll like help you with your rent. Stuff like
yeah, that's prevalent in Milwaukee. Yes, a lot of that happens. It happened to me actually. Yeah.
And people don't realize someone who is struggling with getting work, you know, or a stay-at-home mom during a pandemic. The pandemic has really made a lot more vulnerability, and you know that concerns me, because while we have an increase in vulnerability, we also have an increase in frustrated, pent up men and women who also sometimes buy victims of sex trafficking. So we have kind of a perfect storm of bad.
Right.
And so, to someone who, say, is a young woman who's struggling and she's being approached by that landlord, or she's being approached by someone else saying, like, I can help you as long as you do these 2 things and it won't be that bad. What do you say to that young woman who's sitting there trying to figure out what she's going to do to survive and being handed this choice?
To look at the long term, it might seem like this may be a good idea, but it's not. Use whatever type of resources, whether it's the free food banks, community support. A lot of schools and churches are doing things, hotlines like 311 that you can call. I would rather you go to a neighbor, an elderly neighbor or somebody like that, as opposed to like taking help from that stranger or that person like flashing money saying, I can help you. Because like when it's too good to be true, it usually is. When it seems that way. Yeah.
I believe you. And like we said at the beginning of the episode, you and I have been working to address online sex trafficking, to raise awareness. And, I don't even know how many different shows and things we've been on. But one thing I remember is this letter that you wrote to Craig Newmark, you and another young woman survivor. And we posted it in the Washington Post. And Jim Buckmaster, who was a CEO, and Craig Newmark alleged that you were fake, that you didn't exist. So I thought it'd be really nice for us to say hi to them again.
Right.
And let them
I would love to.
Still. Yeah. So if you want to say hi, go ahead. Let them know that.
Hi, I'm here. I'm real. It was me in the Washington Post.
Surprise.
Right.
But I think it's as much as like some of that's funny that they are now clearly in the wrong, that you don't exist.
Right.
What do you, more seriously, like, what do we say to Craig Newmark, to Jim Buckmaster, to the CEOs, Carl Ferrer and Lacey and Larkin at Backpage, and now this guy from City X Guide, Wilson Martono? What do you say to them about the severity of what they've allowed to happen?
I just say, like, it's evil, it's selfish, it's careless. And like, do you have a mom or sister or a daughter, or even a wife? Like, why is this okay? Like, I don't think there's nothing you can tell me that will make this okay. But I mean, I think they're the scum of the earth. Like, there's nothing, I really don't have anything to say to them.
When you think about the fact that so many traffickers have used those websites and millions of dollars have been made, 40 million for Backpage. This guy was making 21 million, and he was specifically trying to take over the Backpage market because he registered his website the day that Backpage went down. So he knew exactly what he was doing. And the severity of that crime, as well as the magnitude. I used to refer to the owners of Backpage as America's biggest pimps.
Yeah, they are.
But this market, that's the thing people understand is having a huge online presence for the sex trade. If the world were amazing and there was no sex trafficking, that would be a separate conversation.
Right.
But the rights of the few who are there willingly in the trade cannot trump the rights to safety and dignity that so many vulnerable young people and adults are experiencing through sex trafficking. And so until the business model is perfect and completely avoids all trafficking, because even one girl is too many, I don't see that there's any other solution but to hold these individuals accountable.
Yeah, they have to be held accountable, because like, let's say like a normal teenager, like a 16-year-old may end up dating a 19-year-old, and the parents may think it's okay, but a staff member at school finds out, he will be charged with statutory rape. So why is it that it's okay to like have these big old like corporations and people trafficking children and they're not being held accountable? It's really weird.
Yeah, exactly, because they're the fourth link, right? You have the victim,
exactly.
you have the trafficker, you have the sex buyer, and then you have that platform, if you will. And online trafficking doesn't hurt any less. If you're sold online, it doesn't make it better than if you were sold on the streets. Like the pain is still the pain.
Exactly.
Yep. Asia, thank you so much for joining in.
No problem.
I'm sure we'll talk later today. But
Right, we will.
All right, onward. Thank you. So happy to have you as part of the Karana Rising team. And hey, Craig.
I'm glad to be a part of it.
Bye.
All right, bye.
In 2010, 19-year-old Asia Kyle and another teenage survivor of sex trafficking posted a letter in the Washington Post. It was addressed to Craig Newmark, founder of Craigslist. Craig, I am AK. In 2009, I met a man twice my age who pretended to be my boyfriend, and my life as an average girl looking forward to college, doing my chores, and hanging out with friends ended. This boyfriend soon revealed he was a pimp. He put my picture on Craigslist, and I was sold for sex by the hour at truck stops and cheap motels, 10 hours with 10 different men every night. This became my life. Men answered the Craigslist advertisements and paid to rape me. The $30,000 he pocketed each month was facilitated by Craigslist 300 times. I personally know of over 20 girls who were trafficked through Craigslist. Like me, they were taken from city to city, each time sold on a different Craigslist site. Philadelphia, Dallas, Milwaukee, Washington, D.C. My phone would ring and soon men would line up in the parking lot. One Craigslist caller viciously brutalized me, threatening to dump my body in a river. Miraculously, I survived. Following this letter, Craig Newmark's CEO, Jim Buckmaster from Craigslist, wrote back, "Hearing your accounts of being victimized by criminals who you mentioned also misused our site, we are anxious to know that the perpetrators are behind bars. Would you or the advocacy groups who placed the ads please let us know where the police reports were filed? We have been unable thus far to identify police reports matching the crimes you describe. If Craigslist was misused, we want to learn more so we can improve our preventative measures. If anyone committing such crimes has not yet been apprehended and prosecuted, we want to do everything in our power to assist the police in making that happen." As the advocacy front continued, it was clear Craigslist was unwilling to stop their adult section until pressure from survivors and advocates finally made them crumble. That was 2010. Under extreme pressure by survivors and advocates, Craig Newmark closed the adult section of Craigslist, where Asia and thousands more survivors were sold. Enter Backpage. From 2010 till 2018, Backpage led the charge in creating the largest online marketplace where victims of sex trafficking were bought and sold like pizzas. Their profits were more than $40 million in some years. Advocacy mounted and pressure grew. Survivors like this young woman spoke out to reporters like Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times and many, many more outlets. In 2012, 3 teenage girls sued Backpage.com after their traffickers sold them to hundreds of men who bought them off Backpage.com. Due to the Communications Decency Act, these young girls and any other survivors looking to hold Backpage accountable had to prove that Backpage.com knowingly facilitated their trafficking. Their lawyer was Erik Bauer. Erik Bauer now represents a young woman who was suing Craigslist and 3 hotels where she was bought and sold starting at the age of 12. Her case alleges she was raped up to 20 times a day. This young woman has a better chance at justice after the passage of FOSTA SESTA. FOSTA SESTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, and Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act are the U.S. Senate and House bills that make up the FOSTA SESTA package that became law on April 11, 2018. They clarify the country's sex trafficking laws to make it illegal to knowingly assist, facilitate, or support sex trafficking, and amend the Section 230 Safe Harbors of the Communication Decency Act to exclude enforcement of federal or state sex trafficking laws from its immunity. Senate sponsor Rob Portman had previously led an investigation into the online classified service Backpage.com and argued that Section 230 was protecting its unscrupulous business practices. It was not designed to provide immunity to websites that facilitate sex trafficking.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Powell with Karana Rising, Surviving Now, Episode 9, The Price of Selling a Girl. And I have with me today Erik Bauer, and we are talking about an issue that both of us have been working on for, I guess, over a decade at this point, and it's the fact that human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, has been operating relatively in plain sight online on popular websites for pretty much as long as the internet's been around. But there have been particular websites that have not only profited in the millions, up to 40 million in some cases a year, but they've also normalized and created an atmosphere where trafficking blends into other online advertising in a way that makes people feel like it's just another product. But at the heart of it all, we're talking about women and children, predominantly adolescent girls, who are being sold in real life. Their exploitation, just because it's being facilitated by advertisers that traffickers use and buyers use to purchase, does not mean that there's not a real crime and that there's not real trauma and real long-lasting damage to survivors. So Erik and I are going to talk a little bit about that and about some work that he's been doing legally with survivors to reclaim their justice and really flip the script on how trafficking is happening online. So with that, I will let Erik introduce yourself a little bit, share a little bit with the audience what you're working on and kind of how you walked into this space.
Okay, well, it's nice to be here. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, my name's Erik Bauer. I'm a lawyer. My office is up in Tacoma, Washington, which is just south of Seattle. And I've been a lawyer for 35 years, a long time. Done a lot of trial work. I've been a trial lawyer that entire time. And I first got involved with the sex trafficking cases back really in 2011, when a mother approached me. Her child, a junior high school student, had been sold online, had been sold on Backpage.com, advertised for sale, quote, like a pizza, and sold online. And what that really translated into is this child was photographed in her thong underwear, 4 or 5 different photographs, and they were placed in an advertisement, so you could view all 4 photographs in, sexy and provocative poses. And the tagline, different taglines. One read, "Ass up, face down, come see Tasha, $80 specials." And very obvious sex trafficking advertisements. This girl is in 7th grade. She's a 7th grader, and she's being sold with that kind of advertising online. And I looked at this mom and I just said, well, this is illegal. This is aiding and abetting sex trafficking. If I were to go out on a street corner and shout out, "Hey, cocaine for sale, come and get your cocaine. We have cocaine dealers in this building behind you," and I start directing traffic like that, well, I wouldn't be in business for very long at all before the police would shut me down. Likewise, if I did that exact same kind of communication online, they would shut me right down. But for some odd reason, this child sex trafficking advertising lasted and lasted and lasted for decades. And our country and our citizenry really had a different mindset for some reason. And it's odd and should be really examined, because quite honestly, the way I look at it is it's a lot more offensive to sell a child to be raped by perverts than it is to sell cocaine or marijuana or what have you. I mean, drugs are not good, but selling kids is far worse, at least in my opinion. I think most people probably share that.
Right. Well, and one thing that we hear and I don't know if I want to give like those who oppose what you do a platform, but one thing, I've heard over the years in working on particular cases supporting survivors, about 90% of whom were sold online, particularly Craigslist and Backpage. I've heard them say, well, go after the traffickers and go after potentially the buyers, but the online advertisers, they're not doing anything. They're just there to host the ads, and if we attack that, then we attack free speech, and websites will go down, and it'll be like a domino effect. But in your opinion, like, why hold online advertisers accountable alongside buyers and sex traffickers themselves?
Well, and that's a good question. And to answer that, you need to kind of look at the marketing history of human sex trafficking in the United States. At least that's the way I view it. And, it started out with a brothel sort of situation, brothels and slavery, actually. is how it started in the United States. And because slavery certainly wasn't just about picking cotton. You know, I mean, those slave owners were doing horrible sexual things to the slaves all the time they could, and they did. So that was really the first economic marketplace model for sex trafficking. Brothels, you know, slavery, we fought a war over and ended that. And brothels became outlawed really due to political pressure on a local level throughout the United States. And it moved into what we call the track or the street situation, really. That was how the victims would have to walk up and down the streets, and you know, people would pull over and get them. The traffickers or the pimps were typically kind of tough guys that would be able to control a 6-block section of Highway 99 or whatever the local track is. And that really did change when the internet came about. And, you know, all of a sudden you had to be, you know, a kid with a cell phone and a prepaid credit card who was somewhat tech savvy could, hey, there's a neighbor kid, I can start selling her. And that's what happened. And the result, really, and Craigslist, at first it was kind of these offbeat sort of websites akin to City X5, websites no one really knew about except perhaps sex customers and sex sellers. They knew about it, the traffickers and then the tricks. But when it became kind of mainstream, and my belief is Craigslist really brought it into the mainstream, because Craigslist, geez, one of the biggest websites in the world, very, very popular, very useful in many, many ways. I mean, you can sell your couch, your car, you know, apply for a job, all sorts of things, very useful. But they have this one section called, well, they did have the section called erotic services. And erotic services is where a ton of sex trafficking occurred. And it's a well-known destination for sex trafficking. I mean, just the term said it all, erotic services applying in exchange for money. I mean, right. And that's what it was. And they also had their dating site, which was different. They had women for men, things like that. That was dating. Erotic services was something different. And that was where sex could be bought and sold. And it was quid pro quo. And that's exactly what happened. And it mainstreamed it. And due to your efforts and a bunch of other people's very good efforts, and I know you were really at the forefront of that, Craigslist changed erotic services to adult services. That was kind of a big nothing. I think that occurred in 2008 and lasted until sometime in 2010, when your efforts did not abate and you were not fooled by the name change. And right. You know, and so in 2010 they got out of it, basically, you know, at least in large part. They got out of the direct quid pro quo labeling. They abolished the section entirely. There was still a lot of sex trafficking that took place on their dating site and their massage site and all that. But what happened is much of the business transferred over to Backpage.com. And right. Backpage just exploded at that point and went crazy. The first case I did was against Backpage, and it was a case that really occurred in 2010, where these 3 kids were sold on Backpage. And a couple of things to note on that. I mean, number one, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I mean, they have in an amicus brief they filed with the Supreme Court of the state of Washington in our case. They said that due to the internet, that there was, in just a 5-year period, an increase of 1,423% in reports to them of child sex trafficking. So that's a crazy number, a huge number. And why such an increase? Why such a huge increase? And it's just the way it was marketed. It's the marketing model. Instead of kids walking up and down a street where a police officer will likely see them, they're online and they're dressed in camouflage. They are maybe it's not even them. Maybe it's a 20-year-old girl and the trick shows up and there's the 14-year-old.
Right.
But, and that's kind of how it was working. And the Department of Justice has a statistic. They say the average age of entry into the world of sex trafficking is 12 to 13 years of age. Polaris Project, they say it's 15 years of age. That's a tough to survey population. Everyone says it's children, minors. Why is that? They're marketable and they're easy to control and manipulate. They're not used to sex. They're not used to, relationships. It's all a new world for them. So the traffickers can get them. And that's what happens. And it was happening to a huge degree. And the other really scary part about it is internet marketing is just amazing. I mean, look at Amazon. They sell everything. It's just crazy how effective it is. And when it comes to sex advertising, is equally as amazing. Our cases with these 7th grade girls, I mean, they said that, the phone would start ringing within less than 1 minute after the ad hitting Backpage. The phone would start ringing, it would ring off the hook. And they were required to see upwards of 20 adults a day who would come and rape them. Because that's what it is when you're in 7th grade or 8th grade or 9th grade or any age under 18. It's rape, pure, plain and simple. And the guys coming over, they're adults. And I mean, big men, stinky men, drunk men, mean men doing what they want. The child really can't do anything about it. I mean, it's insane. And just the amounts of people, I mean, 20 guys a day, 10, 20, 30 even in one case, the volume was just crazy. And the medical damages that occur to these kids is just over the top. A child that gets raped one time, just once, will suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and often for the rest of her life. A child that's been raped 1,000 times or 2,000 or 10,000, I mean, the damage is just crazy. And they don't even have words for it. And there's a lot of kids that have been afflicted like this in our country, and these are American citizens. They are just our children, our kids. And, the average life expectancy in that world is 7 years, and the death certificates, they don't say died of sex trafficking. They say died of opioid overdose or blunt head trauma or ligature strangulation. It says things like that, right? And it's just a cold, hard reality. A lot of people are under the ignorant impression that this is fun, sexy time for the kids. It's easy money, something like that. They are clueless about trauma bonding. They are clueless about the levels of violence that these traffickers, these pimps use to control and manipulate the kids. They just don't have any idea. And a lot of judges are that way. A lot of cops are that way. I mean, we're changing that. Your efforts and a lot of other hardworking people's efforts to change that are working. And I see a slow, 180 happening, but we have a lot of work left to do for sure.
We do. And what inspired us to have this conversation today was that on June 17th, Wilson Martono, who's the CEO of City X Guide, was arrested with charges that include sex trafficking. He was bringing in 21 million in proceeds in a 2-year span. And so just for the audience's edification, so we had Craigslist, right, which everybody knows, you go get a bicycle, a TV, vintage spoons, whatever. And then also alongside it, as you said, there was the erotic and then the adult section. And no, we were not fooled by that name change. We also knew, as Craig Newmark and Jeff Buckmaster, who was with him at the time, we knew as they shut that section down, which they did in sort of this childish, like, they made this big censor splash page, kind of calling themselves out as victims. And frankly, that just upset me because there's no right you have as a business owner to profit off of somebody else being sold, assaulted, and raped. There's no business model that is predicated on that, because that was the only section they charged money for. No business that is predicated on that model should exist. If your business model and your strategy for income is to work with traffickers to facilitate trafficking, that business model is flawed, like on a very basic level. So not only are you facilitating trafficking, you're actually a terrible business person. In addition to that, so all things aside, when Craigslist shut that section down, although as you said, it still exists there. Backpage, we knew Backpage.com, which at the time was owned by Village Voice Media. We knew they were the heir apparent, if you will. And in 2011, 2012, myself and a colleague from Polaris, we were seeing anywhere from 14,000 to 20,000 sex ads a day. Now, was all of that minors? No. Was all of that trafficking? No. But a lot of it was, and in our opinion, even if it was just one child or even one adult victim, that was enough to keep pushing our campaign forward. And we got incredible pushback. And at the point in time in which things were extremely heated, 2012, 2013, the organization that I had founded and was working with at the time, we had a budget of $200,000. Meanwhile, Backpage was making $40 million a year. And so they were coming after us, and it was this sort of David and Goliath kind of situation. And I know that we were driving them crazy because survivors were speaking up, and every time that they tried to attack them, they looked like jerks. And so they tried all kinds of other tactics to change the website, to say that they were working with law enforcement. And in very few cases they were. But if you stop and just do a little bit of math, because I think people get alarmed thinking about sex trafficking. We often think of the sexual assault and the trauma, and that's very important to think about. But sometimes it's also good to look at some of the numbers. So you have 95% of the survivors I know were sold on Backpage or Craigslist. That's upwards of 1,500 women and girls, mainly minors, mainly adolescents. On average, and this is very basic average, each young woman or child was sexually assaulted 5 times a day for about $100 at a time, anywhere from $50 to $100. And that's 365 days a year, because there's no vacation package with traffickers. They just traffic you all day, every day. So we're talking anywhere from like 1,500 to 2,000 sexual assaults for that child a year. That is a unfathomable trauma. And survivors who I work with every day live with that. It doesn't just because you were rescued in a raid, just because you're able to escape, such as the young girl you're talking about in the case, it doesn't mean that the trauma is over for you and your family, if you have family. And many survivors do not have supportive family behind them, and that is part of why they're being trafficked. And I think that's important for people to understand. We're not talking about a college girl who's like, should I go into nursing? Should I be a prostitute? I think I'll be a prostitute. No, it's oftentimes, individuals who are struggling already because of their gender identity, because of being homeless, because of food insecurity. And now with COVID and the time we're in right now, we're going to see more and more young people destitute and desperate, and traffickers know that. They are skilled at figuring out the core vulnerability of their victims. So when we're talking about individuals being sold online, people like Wilson Martino, Carl Ferrer from Backpage, Craig Newmark, who probably thought I was leaving him alone, and now I'm back. Hey, Craig. I don't think they understand. We're not talking about an equal balance of choices. We're talking about extremely traumatized, vulnerable children and adults who are put into unfathomable situations to survive. Now, that's a fault on our society. We should have better social service programs. We should have better safeguards. We should have better resources for those who are struggling or have experienced exploitation. But that's not the conversation right now. That is a very important conversation. But the real conversation is why did we get to a point where we needed legislation like FOSTA SESTA in order to better safeguard young people and survivors and victims who are being sold online, and why was that legislation important? And this is my question for you. How is that legislation changing your ability to hold online advertisers and other kind of third-party actors, if you will, who are participating or profiting off of the sale of sex trafficking victims. Hey, Erik.
Hi.
So basically, like, what is it that FOSTA SESTA has done to help you process and better support survivor justice? I know you're working on a new case and can't speak to all the details, but I would love for audience to understand why FOSTA SESTA is playing a role in enabling, or better enabling, you to go after these third-party stakeholders, because your previous case was prior to the passage of FOSTA SESTA and actually played a role in inspiring Congress in many ways to pass that legislation.
Yeah, FOSTA SESTA is the main impact that FOSTA SESTA had in my mind was, number one, it got Craigslist completely out of the game with respect to they got rid of all their personal ads. That was the first thing that I really saw. A lot of the other websites, the smaller ones, just said, peace, we're out. We don't want to mess with it. FOSTA SESTA gave a lot of power to the U.S. attorneys, or pardon me, the attorney generals in the different states to go after these different websites if they wanted to. It also provided some remedies to private attorneys to pursue them for cases in with civil damages. That's kind of a lesser impact, however. The main impact I saw was the fact that all of a sudden CDA 230, which a lot of these websites had effectively used as a shield for so many years in these cases, that immunity got taken away to a significant degree. I never used it in the cases I was doing. I managed to get through CDA 230 and was effective in doing that. But quite bluntly, I was the only attorney in the country that managed to think my way through that, and the courts agreed with me on that theoretical approach. And quite bluntly, I was right. It was kind of a simple approach and at its very core, and it was kind of like this, Your Honor, I believe it's illegal for corporations to help pimps sell children to get raped by perverts. That's my legal theory. That's right. Exactly what it was. And the judge is going, well, I need to take this under advisement. Joking. It was just a direct assault on the very idea that you can sell a kid or help a pimp sell a kid and get away with it. I just hit it straight on. It's a revolting idea. It's an incorrect idea. There's nothing right about it. Freedom of speech is a great thing in America, no two ways about it. But not all speech is what we call protected speech. For example, I go into a bank, I have a gun, I say, stick them up. Hey, we call that evidence, not free speech, right? Stick them up is not free protected speech, period. Likewise, if I'm on the street corner saying, hey, cocaine for sale, come get your cocaine. Again, it's evidence.
Right.
If I'm on the same street corner shouting out, kids for sale, hey, I have a whole house full of them right here, do whatever you want, $80 a pop. Well, that's not freedom of speech, is it? Again, it's evidence. And likewise, if you can't do it on a street corner, why should you be able to do it online? Right. It makes zero sense at all. Online just gets a broader, more varied audience. There's more anonymity, and it's far more dangerous. So, in essence, that is my argument, and it's a clear one, and it makes nothing but sense. This idea that you can do illegal stuff online is absolutely ridiculous.
Right, and the thing that always struck me is, there was this, well, we're just publishers. We don't know what they're doing. We're not involved in anything that goes on these pages. And this is where you and I began to intersect a little bit more prior to well, I guess in the early stages of your case, meanwhile, in my little hole in the wall in DC, my colleague and I decided we would create an outreach ad. If Backpage existed and that section, that adult section existed, we were going to place ads ourselves saying, if you need help, call us, call the hotline. You know, we were going to do targeted ads in the DC metro area. So we wrote a poem, and it was very simple. It was very non-judgmental. And I got an email back from their business manager and at Backpage, Pegdella, and he said, I'm sorry, your ad is in the wrong section. We're going to put it in the community section. So that made us all kinds of annoyed, because we were really quite authentically trying to reach victims if they needed help. Fast forward, and those amicus brief with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I was someone who was writing one of the briefs, and I was standing in line at a coffee shop, and it hit me like a wave. Aha. you do control what's going on those pages. You do control content, which is something that a lot of people don't understand. And pushing for FOSTA SESTA, one of the big things we wanted to focus on is, if you were controlling content, if you were aware of what content was going into these ads and that it was trafficking, then you should be held accountable. Likewise, if you're controlling content in regards to something as innocuous as a little outreach ad by a tiny little nonprofit in DC, you were probably controlling a lot of other content. Backpage in particular said that they were screening the ads. They kind of had two strategies that didn't work well together. One was, we don't control content. We don't know what's going on. We're an online publisher protected by the Communications Decency Act. Meanwhile, we screen ads and we make sure that any ad that has trafficking is stamped out. You kind of can't do both. It doesn't really make sense. Now, would I want them to screen the ads? Yes. Were they actually screening ads? Not really. They were screening ads so that they could scrub out particular words that would alarm law enforcement that it might be trafficking, and then they were reposting the ads. And people who say, well, online trafficking is safer because you're not on a street corner. When you're being sexually assaulted, be it because you were standing on a street corner or locked in a hotel, it's not safe either which way. It's still rape, it's still abuse. And when it's online, you have buyers who are much more willing to get involved because it feels like, well, it's on the internet, it feels sanitized, versus like the guy who drives in circles, you know, in downtown DC looking for a girl. That's kind of a different bird than the guy who goes online and can say like, honey, hold on, I've got to do something online, you know, makes an appointment to meet a girl. Honey, I'm going for a jog, and then goes to the hotel, comes back and goes and takes a shower, and meanwhile nobody knows the difference. But you know, for survivors who I've known, some of the trauma that they've talked about the most with me is being sexually assaulted in a hotel, and there's nowhere to run, you can't scream, and no one is going to find you. Their trafficker is not there to protect them in many cases. And obviously I'm speaking from the lived experience of survivors of trafficking. I do know there are individuals involved in the sex trade who are not who do not agree that this is their experience, and I respect that. But of thousands and thousands of survivors I've worked with, their experience has been that sexual assault and rape is a big piece of their exploitation. So with the current case, Erik, that you're working on, how do you think this case could potentially be different from the one that you had before, you know, given the changes of the FOSTA SESTA, but also in some ways the shift in attitude with law enforcement and how they're holding these sites accountable? Hey, Erik, you there?
Hi. Yeah, I'm still here. Just it's freezing, and then you disappeared, and now you're back.
I'm back. So basically, how is this new case different from your previous case?
Well, it's not all that different. It's a little different in that, you know, Backpage, and number one, I really appreciate everything you just said. And, you know, they did hide behind the idea that, gee whiz, we don't know what's going on. We don't know how we made actually as much as $150 million last year, you know, off the sex trafficking section. I mean, a ton of money Backpage was making. And, you know, it was nuts. And it's just ridiculous. Why did all the ads go to that company? Why were they all going to Backpage? Why did they all go to Craigslist erotic services? Was it by accident that all of a sudden all the traffickers are posting all the ads on these two companies' websites? Or were they doing something to encourage that to happen, perhaps, so they could make tens of millions of dollars every year? I mean, does Facebook have this problem like this? Do they have a section entitled erotic services or escorts for sale? No, they don't. Neither does Match.com. I'm not saying that sex trafficking never happens on Facebook or Match.com, but the company's business models don't seem to be pointed in that direction. They're not actively encouraging that as a mainstay of what they do. And so it's completely different. I mean, you can undoubtedly find people for sale on Facebook, but you're going to have to sift through a whole lot of stuff to find it. I wouldn't know how to do it right now. I suppose there's people more into it than I am, or more knowledgeable about that can do it, but not me. And they don't have that section set up for that purpose, whereas Backpage certainly did, and so did Craigslist. And you can't tell me that these companies don't understand precisely what is going on their own websites. They understand. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of sex trafficking ads on both those websites every year, every single year, and all across the nation. And you can't tell me the owners of those websites didn't know about it. They knew exactly what was going on. And it's that easy. When it's the mainstay of their business model, of course they know. It's silly to suggest otherwise,
And I think that's really critical for people to understand, and thinking about, I also hear the argument that, survivors just want to be litigious and want to get money. Well, in advancing these cases for justice for survivors, it's, I don't see a problem in them wanting to be civilly remedied for the pain and exploitation that they've experienced, not to mention the fact that after experiencing trafficking, for many survivors, it's very hard to go on with your life. It is very hard to maintain a job, to have relationships, to thrive, and many do. And my team members are some of those amazing survivors, but it still sits with you, and all of the trauma and abuse and exploitation that you experienced before you were in a trafficking situation is still there. And now you've got this on top of it. And so having the ability to have a court say you were wronged and you deserve justice, it's more than just about money. It's about restoring someone's sense of worth.
And amen to everything you just said there, for sure. And the way I have framed it, in my world, which is the world of justice, the world of courts and law. I mean, really, prior to our entry into this game, if you will, of this cause in 2011, the justice system. Do you know what we would do with a kid that has been raped 1,000 times? Sold 1,000 times to be raped? Well, you lock her up, of course, right? You just throw her in jail. You call her a hoe. You call her a prostitute. You give her a criminal record so she can't get a regular job anywhere. That's what you do with a 15-year-old girl, because she's just worthless, And right. That's how we were treating girls nationwide. And that was what has been going on historically in our country. We take these poor kids that have been subject to just unfathomable abuse, and we just rub it in, we sink it in, and just lock them up.
Right, which actually convinces them that they are in the wrong, because traffickers say, if anyone finds out, you're going to go to jail, no one will believe you, you're just going to be called a hoe. And then when kids or adult survivors get arrested, not only is it wrong and traumatizing, you're actually proving the trafficker right.
You're so correct on that. It just sinks it in even more and absolutely defines them in their own minds who they are. It's their fault. They're nothing but this person, you know, and, you know, so what we've been trying to do, and I think with some success, is, you know, move the needle. Stop treating these kids like they are criminals. Stop criminalizing them, and treat them like victims, and maybe move the needle all the way over to, yeah, they are American citizens with civil rights that can be enforced in a court of law against the entities and the perpetrators that are profiting off of their trauma. Right. What's wrong with that idea? You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with that idea. And these corporations, these big corporations making $150 million a year through jacking up the rates of child sex trafficking by 1,423%. It's a crazy huge number. And I can get into that more later. But, you know, those corporations, they don't bleed red. They bleed green. That's it. That's the only way you can hurt them. Take their money, give it to the kids.
And there are websites that aggregate this exploitation. This is a somewhat off topic, but not really. There's another website called Pornhub, and they had a whole section on Pornhub called Backpage, and it was them getting videos of people who are advertised on Backpage.com, aggregating them and putting them in part of the website for people to watch. Now, why would a business model? Why would you do that? Because you know that type of sex sells. So if Pornhub identified what was on Backpage, what was on City X Guy, what was even on Craigslist as something that would sell, you've got to know that those other websites viewed it that way as well. And so when we think about shifting the conversation, you know, getting even deeper into survivor justice, which is what we focus on at Karana Rising, survivors continue to be arrested. In 2017, 284 children were still arrested for prostitution, despite over, I think, 38 states now have legislation to protect children from arrest for solicitation and prostitution. And I won't go down that rabbit hole of explaining that whole legislative battle, but we have that happening. You have young girls like Crystal Kuzner, who was just released in Milwaukee for shooting in self-defense her trafficker who had been exploiting her. He had been arrested prior for charges of child abuse and sexual assault, but he was released. Meanwhile, he's walking free. He's exploiting this very tiny little teenage girl, this child. She gets his gun and she finally defends herself. And you have girls across the country who are being arrested and locked up for simple charges, not just prostitution, solicitation, and law enforcement know that they're victims of trafficking. Meanwhile, these wealthy men, be it, you know, the owners of Backpage, City X Guide, Jeffrey Epstein, these guys use our society's obsession with money and power to protect themselves and to walk away looking scot-free. What I think is interesting about cases like the legislation you're advancing now to support a survivor's justice against those who facilitated her sale, and previous cases that you worked on, what I think is important about that is we're shifting the landscape to say, we're not going to be looking at her to see what she did wrong. We're going to be looking at the actual perpetrators at this time and understand and hold them accountable, because you're right. If websites start to understand that if they willingly create a business model that's predicated on allowing sex trafficking to run free on their website, and I'm not talking about the sex trade, just sex trafficking, because if I can figure out that an ad is a trafficking victim versus someone willing in the sex trade, you know they can. So I feel like we have to start looking holistically at the business model of trafficking and breaking it down. And that means going after the marketplace, because street corners is one thing, but the biggest marketplace for the buying and selling of women and girls was Backpage.com, then it was City X Guide. It's going to keep happening. And to that, you know, we're not tired. We'll keep going. But holding those individuals accountable, seeking justice for survivors is really, I think, what's going to shift the landscape, to say, like, you can't get away with this forever. We are going to find you.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I mean, we need to just keep gunning for these guys, keep going after them. And, you know, I'm working with kind of a network of attorneys. You know, we kicked the door open for sure. And we're freely sharing what we have learned with other people. And now I've teamed up with some larger law firms to help shove these cases through against not only websites, but hotels and other entities that are, at fault. I mean, there's, this case we've filed in federal court here in Tacoma, it involves a bunch of Motel 6s and Howard Johnsons and, Craigslist. I mean,
we know that those are some of the worst hotels. I mean,
yeah.
I had this saying that is doors on the outside, pimps on the inside. These hotels that look the other way, those hourly rates and, all of that, that's, they know what they're doing.
People understand their own business. I mean, they don't stay in business if they don't get it, right?
Right. And if they're not making money, why profit? And so they know what they're doing. Well, Erik, we are coming to close of the show. I just so appreciate the work that you're doing and the integrity and the effort. Many of our listeners will not know that you are a one-man show with a dog on a farm, and just, really slogging it out. And I often tell people you're a modern day real life Atticus Fitch. And it's a real honor to work with you, and hopefully, combined efforts of survivors and you and other law firms who are finally joining the bandwagon and supporting survivor justice. Hopefully we can continue to hold these individuals accountable and ultimately shift the culture so that people understand what's underneath those ads is a real girl, and the price that she pays for us allowing her to be bought and sold is a lifetime of trauma that often ends tragically very short. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
This is Andrea Powell with Karana Rising, Surviving Now, episode 9, signing out. Thank you. Bye.